Number 10. Stoning. There was no single executioner. That was the point. When a community in the ancient world sentenced someone to death by stoning, it did not hand the task to one soldier or one official. It handed the task to everyone: neighbors, relatives, strangers. Ancient legal codes across Mesopotamia and the Levant describe stoning as a punishment reserved for crimes considered offenses against the entire community, not just one victim. And that detail changes everything about how it worked. A sword needs one hand. Stoning needs a crowd willing to participate. Historical and religious texts from the ancient Near East describe the condemned being taken outside the settlement, away from daily life, as if the act itself required distance from the ordinary world. Witnesses were often required to throw the first stones, a detail some scholars argue was designed to force accountability onto the accuser, not just the accused. Death was rarely instant. It came from repeated blunt trauma, sometimes over several minutes, sometimes longer, depending on the size of the crowd and the size of the stones. What makes this event particularly terrifying is not just its brutality. It is what it reveals about ancient justice, that punishment was never meant to be private. It was meant to be shared, so that guilt could never rest on one set of hands. The victim died in public, by the public, for the public. Number 9. Beheading by sword. In the ancient world, a fast death was not a right. It was a privilege. Beheading is often remembered today as the simple execution, but across Rome, Persia, and Imperial China, it carried a specific social meaning. This was the death reserved for people of status. Roman citizens, for example, were legally protected from crucifixion in most circumstances. If a citizen was condemned to death, decapitation by sword was often the method used instead, a distinction written directly into Roman law. The mechanics were brutally simple. A single trained strike, ideally instant, performed by an executioner whose entire skill was measured in how cleanly he could end a life in one motion. Roman historical accounts describe professional executioners maintaining and testing their blades specifically to avoid a failed first strike, because a failed strike meant a second blow, and a second blow meant suffering that undermined the entire point of the method. What makes this execution disturbing is not the act itself, but the hierarchy hidden inside it. Even in death, the ancient world sorted people by class. A senator and a slave could commit the same crime and receive completely different endings. One clean, one prolonged. The blade fell in less than a second. The system behind it took centuries to build. Number 8. Live burial. They gave her bread, a small amount of oil, and a lamp with just enough fuel to burn for a short time. Then they sealed the door. In ancient Rome, a Vestal Virgin, one of the priestesses sworn to maintain the sacred fire of the state, who broke her vow of chastity, faced one of the strangest legal punishments in the ancient world. Roman law forbade shedding the blood of a Vestal, so instead she was led into an underground chamber, sealed inside with a token supply of food, and left. Roman writers, including Plutarch, describe the ritual in unsettling detail. The condemned carried through the city in a covered litter so the public could not see her face, lowered into a chamber built specifically for this purpose, and buried alive beneath the earth. No blood was shed. Rome could tell itself, legally, that this was not an execution by violence. It was simply removal from the world. What makes this method so unsettling is the illusion of mercy built into it. The small supply of food and light was never meant to save her. It existed only so Rome could claim, technically, that she had a chance. The chamber was sealed. The earth was packed down above it, and the city moved on, as if the ground itself had simply closed over a mistake. Number 7. Damatio ad bestias, thrown to the beasts. 50,000 people bought tickets to watch this happen. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was one of Rome's most theatrical punishments, reserved specifically for those the state wanted the public to see suffer. Historical accounts and surviving amphitheater records describe condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and members of persecuted groups released into arenas alongside lions, leopards, and bears imported from across the empire specifically for this purpose. This was not a private death. It was scheduled entertainment, listed alongside gladiatorial games as part of a full day's program at venues including the Colosseum. Some accounts describe condemned individuals being tied to stakes or restrained to prevent any chance of escape, ensuring the outcome was never in doubt. The Roman appetite for imported exotic animals for these events was large enough that historians argue it contributed to the depletion of certain wild animal populations across North Africa in antiquity. What makes this event particularly terrifying is the audience. This was not punishment carried out in shadow. It was staged, ticketed, and applauded. A death turned into an afternoon of public entertainment for tens of thousands of ordinary citizens. The crowd cheered. The sand absorbed the blood, and by the next morning, it was raked clean for the following show. Number 6. Impalement. The victim wasn't the real target. Everyone watching from the road was. Impalement is documented across multiple ancient civilizations, and Assyrian palace reliefs from as early as the 9th century BCE depict the practice in graphic detail, carved into stone specifically so the message would outlast the individual event. These were not accidents of history. They were propaganda, permanently recorded on royal monuments. The method was engineered for visibility and duration, not speed. A sharpened stake and a positioning of the body designed to prolong the process rather than end it quickly. Ancient Assyrian and later historical accounts describe rows of impaled bodies left along roads or outside conquered cities, a warning positioned exactly where the maximum number of future rebels would see it. What makes this method disturbing is that the death itself was almost secondary. The real function was communication. A conquering power wanted every traveler on that road, for weeks afterward, to understand exactly what resistance would cost them. The bodies remained long after the army had moved on. The message did too, but the methods that follow weren't designed to send a message to strangers on a road. They were designed to punish the individual directly, and that shift changes everything about how terrifying they become. Number 5. Boiling alive. Some records describe lowering the condemned into the vessel in stages, not all at once. A detail historians point to as evidence the method was deliberately engineered to extend suffering rather than end it. Execution by boiling appears in various ancient and medieval legal codes, including specific statutes in parts of Europe that formally listed it as a punishment for crimes such as poisoning or counterfeiting, offences considered a betrayal of trust rather than simple violence. The condemned was placed into a large vessel filled with water, oil, or occasionally other liquids, which was then heated, sometimes gradually, sometimes rapidly, depending on the jurisdiction and the severity assigned to the crime. Some historical records specify the liquid and the exact legal justification, treating the method less like a chaotic act of cruelty and more like a formally regulated punishment with defined procedures. What makes this event particularly terrifying is the bureaucracy behind it. This wasn't a mob or a battlefield decision. It was written into law with defined procedures, specific crimes attached to it, and officials responsible for carrying it out precisely as codified. The law didn't just permit this death. In some places, It scheduled it. Number 4, the brazen bull. The inventor became the first person to test it. According to ancient accounts, including references preserved by later Greek and Roman writers, the brazen bull was a hollow bronze sculpture commissioned by Phalaris, a tyrant of the Sicilian city of Agrigentum in the 6th century BCE. The design, credited to a craftsman named Perillus, was intended to be Phalaris's ultimate instrument of execution, and, according to the same accounts, Perillus was the first person placed inside it. On the tyrant's orders, the mechanism was engineered cruelty in its purest form. The condemned was sealed inside the hollow bronze bull, and a fire was lit beneath it. As the metal heated, the victim's screams, distorted through tubes built into the bull's nasal passages, were designed to emerge sounding like the bellowing of an actual bull, turning agony into a form of grotesque performance. What makes this device disturbing is not just the death itself, but the intention behind its design. This wasn't punishment improvised in anger. It was commissioned, engineered, and refined specifically to disguise human suffering as spectacle. Ancient sources disagree on some details of the story, and some elements may be exaggerated or partly legendary. But what remains undisputed is that ancient writers across multiple centuries treated the brazen bull as a real and infamous symbol of tyranny. Proof that cruelty in the ancient world could also be a craft. Number 3, crucifixion. Rome didn't want you to die quickly. Rome wanted you to be seen dying slowly. Crucifixion is one of the most historically documented execution methods in the ancient world, used by Rome primarily against slaves, foreign enemies, and those convicted of crimes against the state, a punishment deliberately withheld from Roman citizens in most cases, which tells you exactly what function it served. The condemned was nailed or bound to a wooden structure and left exposed, often at a major roadside or gathering point, for hours or even days. Death typically came not from blood loss, but from a combination of exhaustion, asphyxiation, and organ failure, as the body's own weight made breathing progressively more difficult. Roman writers describe crucifixion sites deliberately placed along major roads leading into cities, ensuring that anyone entering would see exactly what defiance of Rome resulted in. What makes this event particularly terrifying is the timeline. This was not a punishment measured in seconds or minutes. It was measured in days, engineered specifically so that suffering itself became the public message, visible to everyone who passed. The victim did not die in an instant. Rome made sure the entire city could watch it happen slowly. But there is a more advanced version of this idea: deliberate, extended suffering that Rome never came close to matching, and it comes from the other side of the ancient world. Number 2, lynching, death by 1,000 cuts. The executioner's skill was measured by how long he could keep the prisoner alive. Lynching, used in Imperial China for offences considered the most severe betrayals of the state, including treason, was a method built entirely around control and duration rather than force. Historical Chinese legal records describe it as a punishment reserved for crimes that were seen as an attack on the social and political order itself. The process involved a series of controlled cuts to the body, performed by a trained executioner over an extended period, with the explicit goal of prolonging the ordeal rather than ending it quickly. Historical accounts describe the method being adjusted in severity depending on the crime and the emperor's specific orders. In some cases intended to be relatively fast, in others deliberately extended for maximum suffering as an additional layer of punishment. The practice remained part of the Chinese legal system for centuries before being formally abolished in the early 20th century. What makes this method frightening is not brutality alone. It is precision. This was not chaos. It was a controlled procedure, refined over generations, where a skilled executioner's reputation depended on his ability to manage suffering like a craft, rather than deliver a single decisive blow. The state didn't just want the person to die. It wanted the process to be remembered by everyone who heard about it. And still, one method from the ancient world goes even further than this, not through violence, but through the illusion of care. Number one, scaphism. The boats. They fed him, not out of mercy, to make sure he didn't die too soon. Scaphism is described in ancient sources, most notably by the Greek writer Plutarch, as a method of execution associated with ancient Persia, used specifically against those who had committed the gravest offences against the crown. Historians today debate exactly how widespread the practice actually was, and some caution that ancient accounts may contain exaggeration. But the description that has survived remains one of the most disturbing execution methods recorded in ancient history. According to the surviving account, the condemned was placed between two hollowed-out boats or trunks, fastened together with only the head, hands, and feet left exposed. He was then force-fed milk and honey repeatedly, and his exposed skin was coated in the same substance, deliberately attracting insects. The vessel was left exposed in the sun, sometimes on stagnant water, for an extended period, with the feeding continued specifically to keep the body alive as long as possible, prolonging the ordeal rather than shortening it. Some ancient accounts describe the process lasting well over a week before death finally came. What makes this event so disturbing is not just its cruelty, but its logic. Every element of the method, the food, the honey, the exposure, was designed with a single specific goal: prevent a quick death. This wasn't punishment through violence. It was punishment through sustained biological survival, turned into the instrument of suffering itself. The ancient world produced execution methods built on speed, on spectacle, on precision, and on public message. But scaphism represents something colder than all of them, a method where staying alive was the punishment, and death, when it finally came, arrived as